Well, it's a nice, cozy group. So I'm going to take advantage of it and make it a nice, informal discussion. So let me greet the president of Sunway Group, Dato Chu Chikin, Professor Ye of the GCI, Joyce, of course, the distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Selamat petang, as they say, and good afternoon to you all. Now, we are fortunate that we have these three distinguished speakers who were actually invited by the MEA, Malaysian Economic Association, with the cooperation of the British High Commissioner, the Indonesian Embassy, and Westminster Foundation, who kindly made these people available to us. As you will find from their talk, they are experts in the field of parliamentary democracy and especially select committees. Yesterday, I understand, with Tun Musa there, they had a good discussion on the exact topic was governance, the role of parliamentary committees. But this panel focused on lessons from international experience. So there was discussion from US, UK, Australia, India, and many other countries. Today, they will talk about the effectiveness of select committees. Now, as a Malaysian in a Malaysian environment, I think this is something quite new in the sense that we know about it, but we don't really practice it. We don't have too many select committees. Now, what are select committees? They are committees made up of parliamentarians, sometimes joint Senate and lower house, sometimes the lower house, different kinds of committees, but basically committed to the cause of doing some detailed studies on the issues discussed in Parliament. As you know, in our Parliament, sometimes some things are passed very fast. There, before you know where you are, it has gone through the Parliament. And there is hardly a decent role for select committees. I think this is something that is going to come and must come, because otherwise, to my mind, democracy gets abused. Why is there a reluctance? I was a civil servant for about 30 years, and I must share this with you, that the ministers did not like select committees. Why? Because it means more work. It means answering too many questions. It means too much preparation. And if the ministers didn't like it, we officials also enjoyed the privilege of not wanting select committees. And so it was never raised as an issue. But thanks to, I think, Tan Sri Sharif and Malaysian Economic Association, and they have got this idea, resuscitated this idea, so to speak. And I hope there will be now, after this discussion and yesterday's meeting, there will be a growing trend to have more and more select committees. I think that was the consensus yesterday, that there should be more select committees. But the real issue is, you can have the select committees, but will they be effective? As you know, we have the Public Accounts Committee, which is one of the very few select committees. They considered a report and did not have the appendix displayed or for discussion in Parliament. Now, that is a good committee, but if they cannot be effective, you might as well not have a committee, because then there's an abuse of democracy, and it violates the very principles of practicing good governance. My background is economics, and I find over the years that you can have the best institutions, but if they are not governed properly or they do not do their work properly, all the wealth that you can have will be slowly eroded. Now, as I said, I was in government a long time. I like this topic very much. But I'm not going to dwell on it because then I'll become a panelist. So let me just warmly welcome the speakers and invite the first speaker, the Right Honorable Norman Baker. He's had a colorful history, I noticed. He's been 18 years in Parliament. He was Minister of Transportation. I was Secretary General of PermSec of Transport, and it's a fascinating ministry. But he also has a colorful background in it being very varied. He was running a railway station, running a wine shop. I would like to visit his wine shop. And served as party's environmental campaigner in the House of Commons. He's also regional executive director, he was controlling 26 shops. So there is scope for him to come here, talk to us about good governance, and at the same time, tell us how to run our businesses. So I have great pleasure now in calling upon Mr. Norman Baker to address us.
Thank you for the introduction, and as you've heard, I spent 18 years in Parliament as an MP, and 13 of those were in opposition, and then I spent almost 5 in government as a Minister, first for Transport for 3.5 years, and then a year as number 2 to Theresa May, who was our new Prime Minister when she was at that point Home Secretary, and I was Minister for Crime Prevention. So in terms of select committees, I've had both the opportunity to serve on committees as an opposition member, and I served on, at various times, one scrutinising European legislation, one on the Human Rights Committee, which was a joint committee with the House of Lords, our other house, and also I served on, I can't remember the third one, the Environmental Audit Committee, which was a cross-cutting committee looking at environmental matters across government. So I got a good flavour of those, and then as a minister I had both to attend, be summoned by committees and answer questions by members of Parliament, but also then officially to draft the responses from the government, or at least sign off the responses, which we sent to the committees when they produced reports. So I've seen things from both ends. What I would say first of all is that select committees are important, but they are, and I'll tell you what they are in a minute in the British context, but they are only one part of the jigsaw. And you've heard indeed from the introduction that it's not just the existence of a committee, it's how important and effective it can be. And there are I would say there are a number of elements of a successful functioning democracy that need to be in place. One of them is certainly a select committee process, but there are others as well. One is the independence of Parliament from the executive. In my view, is very important. Parliament needs to be able to control its own budget, to appoint its own staff, to determine its own resources, to decide how much MPs are paid and so on. That should not be a government function. Secondly, you need a free press, able to report what's happening, and also a diverse press. There's no point having a free press if they're all controlled by one person. So you need a diverse press as well. You need freedom of information so that the ordinary person can find out what the government is doing in their name. And that means the approach of secrecy, which has been so endemic across the world, needs to be replaced by one supporting freedom of information. And you need to make sure that there is a fair electoral system, and party funding is a level playing field, we say, so we don't have one party in any country which is able to distort the election result because of funding. So all those elements come together, And if you have all those wider elements, then the select committee system can work within the Parliament. Now, the way it works in the UK is that select committees are well established, and their independence is very much celebrated, and the government cannot interfere in who's on the committee or what they do. First of all, there is a committee to shadow every department. So if you have a department for transport, or you have a department for work and pensions, or a department for Northern Ireland, or whatever the department is, there is a select committee which shadows that particular department. There are also committees which are cross-cutting and which look across government, because some issues, of course, don't relate to just one department, they relate to many departments. So, for example, in financial terms, we have our own Public Accounts Committee, which doesn't look at why government spends money, but how government spends money, and wants to know why, for example, our new high-speed rail line is way over budget, and wants to bring in the chief officials and the ministers to answer that question. We also have, I mentioned the Environmental Audit Committee. This is a very important committee in my view, which looks at policy, say, on climate change, and then can ask different departments what they are doing on climate change. Not simply a matter for the Environment Department, it's also a matter, for example, for transport or other departments too, which have an impact. So they can bring in different departments to answer questions on that. There's a Human Rights Committee, which again looks much wider than one department, and so on. So we have a large number of committees. Now they are elected, those committees, in the following way. After a general election, and we've had one last year in the UK, of course, what happens is that the number of chairs of committee by each party is determined by the proportionality of the House of Commons. So in other words, if there are 19 committees, I think there's more than that, but if, let's say for argument, there are 19 committees, then to reflect the election result, 10 of those will be chaired by the party which has won, the Conservatives in this case, and 9 would be chaired by members of opposition parties, proportionate to the votes which they received, or number of seats actually, not votes, number of seats which they received in the House of Commons. So there are many committees, therefore, chaired by opposition MPs. Now, what happens is if there is a committee which is to be chaired by, let's say, a Labour MP, Labour MPs will decide themselves who they want to put forward, or people will decide if they want to put themselves forward. And there may be, say, 3 people who want to stand from the Labour Party to chair that particular committee. There is then a secret ballot of all members of the House of Commons from all parties to elect that Labour member who will be the chair of that committee. So it's a secret ballot because we want to stop the party system, the party whips, from influencing people, so people can vote honestly what they believe to be the best person for that job. The other members of the committee are allocated proportionally, again according to the results of the general election, and all the parties are required to have a proper process to elect their own members within their own ranks to be on that committee. So you will see that they're elected for 5 years. So you will see that the influence of the government in these matters is zero. It's a matter for the House of Commons or for the individual parties as to who was on the committees, and that's a strength. Now, the committees then have their own special advisors. They are paid for out of parliamentary funds, so the government again has no say on how much money the committees have. They will appoint professional experts. They can call on expertise from outside. For example, they use the university system to bring people in for particular advice on particular subjects. So again, they're well resourced in that sense. And then, of course, they can decide what they want to investigate. They can decide their own agenda. And they will take advice perhaps from the public. The public will also send in ideas and say, this is a shocking situation. We think your committee should look at it. And the committee can decide to do that if it wants to do that. But they decide their own agenda. The government, again, has no say in what the select committee does. And having decided they want to have a particular inquiry, that inquiry then will summon witnesses who have to attend. People don't want to attend sometimes. I was just saying to Anna here that Rupert Murdoch had to attend to answer questions in our committee. didn't want to go there and pretended he had amnesia when he got there, but nevertheless he turned up. We also had the vice president, I think, of Google, who again didn't want to turn up, but had to come and explain about their tax arrangements to one of the committees. So people have to come, and they can be forced to come if they don't come. Ministers are required to come along, so I've been summoned to committees when I was a minister, not necessarily just to my own committee. So when I was a Home Office minister, I was also summoned to something called the Public Administration Committee, to talk about how the relationship between MPs and ministers works. So all sorts of committees can summon you, and you have to come along and give evidence. So these are robust. Now, one of the good things about committees in the UK, and I think Anna will tell you it's the same in Australia, is that they do tend to work on a consensual basis. So people tend to put their party hats to one side, and they will work on the subject. They get very interested in the subject, whatever it is, and they tend to look at the facts, they hear from the witnesses, and naturally the evidence points to particular conclusions. And they're the conclusions which the committee will bring forward. And nearly all reports from the committees are consensual and unanimous, and it's very rare to have minority reports where they split on party lines. So people forget their party hats on these occasions. And when they do that, you will often have, therefore, a Conservative chair of the committee criticising the Conservative government on behalf of the committee. There's no sanction against that person. The government understands that's their role and accepts that that's part of the democratic process. It's a separate channel of promotion for MPs. Some MPs are very happy being backbenchers. Some want to be ministers, as I did. Others want to be select committee chair. That's the route they choose. And they are paid, by the way, extra money for being chair of the select committee. And therefore they are independent. They don't want to be ministers, and therefore the pressure that can be exerted upon them is limited in terms of what they do. They will then produce this consensual report. It normally receives quite a lot of coverage. Normally it will receive coverage on the main radio.
Sorry, can I interrupt you? Is our timekeeper on duty?
Are we all right?
We haven't heard from you, so I was wondering whether perhaps you were taking a rest or... But you are operating good for you. Thank you.
Okay. If you want me to shut up, you just tell me to shut up, and that will be fine. So they'll get major television and radio coverage, including on what we have the Today programme, which is the main radio programme, which is listened to by millions of people, and the chair will probably be interviewed on that about the report. The report is then produced with recommendations. The government then must respond to that within 60 days. And it must answer the recommendations. It doesn't have to agree to them, though quite often the government will agree to them actually, but it can refuse to agree, of course, but they have to give reasons. They can't just say we're not doing it. They have to give reasons why they're not agreeing to it. And ultimately, if the government either doesn't respond in time, which is very rare, or if the government dismisses the recommendations in a way that doesn't command support, then there can be a debate on the floor of the House of Commons with all MPs on that select committee report. So that's a sanction that the government has to deal with. If they don't deal with the system properly, they can be forced to debate the matter on the floor of the House of Commons. So in short, I think the system works well. It does work on a consensual basis. It does change government policy. It's seen by the government of the day, not just by this government, but any government, as non-threatening, because it's not coming from the opposition, it's coming from a consensual select committee, and therefore it carries weight, and the government therefore can introduce some of the recommendations without necessarily losing face, which they would do if the opposition necessarily on their own put it forward. So in that sense, I think the select committee system works. It can also go out and undertake visits and studies if it wants to do that. And when I was in the Human Rights Committee, for example, we went to Australia to look at the Human Rights Commission over there. We didn't have that in the UK at the time, and New Zealand as well. We can also undertake visits in the UK, and certainly if we want to see on the transport side, for example, what was working well, they would go to look at, say, the light rail system in Manchester, which was much more successful than others. So in essence, it's a good system, and it's an essential part of democracy, but it can only work effectively if it's working in conjunction with the other matters I raised at the beginning of my contribution here today.
Thank you very much. Give him a big, big clap. Now, I thought I'll make it a bit more relaxed, Devo style. Let me anticipate what is in the minds of many. It's certainly on my mind. Is there a way of measuring effectiveness? Is there an index? Because otherwise, we can all be very happy that we've got all these things, and in the end, you do not know how effective. Number two, where do the funding, are there no limitations? Can government control the work of the select committees by limiting their funds?
The answer to the second one is very clearly no, because the funds are voted through by Parliament, and Parliament controls this, not the government in any way or any shape or form. And the people employed by the select committees, and indeed by the House of Commons generally, are parliamentary employees. They are not government employees. They are not civil servants. They are a completely different group of people. So the government has, in a government, is outside this. The government has to come in to Parliament. It is not that the Parliament is some sort of department of government. It certainly isn't. It's a completely separate organisation from government, and the government ministers come in, but they are in a sense guests of Parliament when they come in. In terms of effectiveness, that's more an art rather than a science, I think, in terms of how effective they are. You can look at some statistics which don't tell you how effective it is. For example, how many meetings they've had, or how many reports they've produced. You can even look at how many recommendations they've had and how many have been accepted. So you can measure that. But ultimately, it's a matter of people know which committees are effective, which aren't. And often it's down to the chair. We've got one or two committees. A Home Affairs Committee, which I had to go and give evidence to, has got a very effective chair called Keith Vaz. And we have to, and I'll tell you that is a very effective committee. Other committees where the chair is ineffective, then the committee doesn't work as well. So, but that's an art rather than a science. But you can measure some things, but they don't necessarily give you the answer which you would want to have.
Just a little concern. In the end, the Minister of Finance has to judge whether he can afford it or not.
No.
And how would you have, this is the conflict in my mind, how would you ensure that this parliamentary committee doesn't ask for funds that cannot be afforded?
Well, to be honest, if we're spending about £70 billion on Trident, I'm sure a few 100,000 here or there on committees doesn't count for very much. What Parliament spends in terms of the overall public expenditure is minimal, to be honest with you. And I think you can't put a price on democracy is probably the answer I'd give. But Parliament, of course, even if they went on overseas trips every week, you still couldn't spend that much money, really, in the big scheme of things. They don't. I mean, I have to say they don't. People do exercise some self-control. And ultimately, if a committee decides to waste money by going on so many trips for no purpose, then in a democracy, our newspapers would pick up on this, and they would start running stories about MPs going on junkets abroad. So there's a self-control which exercises that people are aware that they could be accused of wasting money, and therefore they exercise some self-control, I think.
Thank you. I think what you said at the beginning is very relevant. For these committees to be effective, you must have the right environment. A free press, freedom to comment, a real democratic environment. Otherwise, you will have it skewed. Yeah. So thank you very much. Give him another big clap. He deserves it. Now, can I have John speak first, because he's got a flight to catch. Satu jam lagi, 2 jam. Oh, lama, susah. So he got a flight to catch, and let's have him. He is another colourful. Members of Parliament obviously are leaders in their own right under any circumstance. So they all have very impressive biodata. Now, he is a House of Representatives, a National Mandate Party. He's been MP for about 5 years. He currently is a Commission on economy, banking, finance, national planning. You control the whole works. He must be some kind of czar, economic czar there. And also there's regional and international economy. He's a man with a wide experience. So I now call upon Dr. Erizal to speak to us. Okay, bye.
Thank you, Chairman. Please allow me to use bahasa because I love my bahasa, and then
Dua-dua
my
pun
bahasa
boleh.
better than my English. Terima kasih, Chairman. Bapak Ibu sekalian, kehadiran saya di sini diundang oleh Malaysian Economics Association melalui Westminster. Kenapa saya hadir itu penting sekali. Saya melihat angle atau sudut yang disampaikan pada kesempatan ini banyak dari sisi sistem parlementer. Indonesia sendiri sistemnya presidensial. Oleh karena itu saya berminat untuk hadir, kemudian memberi bertukar pikiran dengan yang hadir di sini. Di parlemen kebetulan saya ada di Komisi 11 dan banyak berhubungan dengan yang berkaitan dengan komite-komite yang tadi disampaikan berkaitan dengan anggaran dan seterusnya. Di parlemen sendiri kami punya pengalaman beberapa tahun yang lalu sebelum 1998, maybe sama seperti kondisi sekarang di Malaysia, kekuatan pemerintah itu jauh di atas ketuaan parlemen. Parlemen lebih kepada stempel, mengendorse apa saja yang diinginkan pemerintah. Sepanjang pemerintah itu bagus memang tidak ada masalah. Tapi begitu program pemerintah itu tidak sesuai dengan harapan rakyat, di situ timbul masalah. Nah, kemudian 1998 chairman dari partai kami mendorong terjadinya reformasi, yaitu Bapak Amin Rais. Nah, reformasi ini dilakukan merubah total sistem. Dari sistem yang tadinya heavy-nya ada ke pemerintah, ini beralih heavy-nya ada ke parlemen. Nah, di parlemen sendiri, begitu kuatnya parlemen, banyak permasalahan-permasalahan parlemen ikut ambil over. Di antaranya penurunan presiden, kita pernah ketahui di Indonesia beberapa kali ada kejadian penurunan presiden di impeach. Kemudian setelah itu dirasakan parlemen terlalu kuat, kemudian timbul lagi undang-undang baru supaya ada balancing. Sehingga parlemen perannya betul-betul ditempatkan sesuai porsinya. Nah, ini juga yang mendorong kita di parlemen agar semua institusi yang ada di Indonesia juga ditempatkan sesuai kapasitas dan porsinya. Oleh karena itu kita juga sangat mendorong pemerintah melalui komite-komite yang ditetapkan, dan banyak sekali sekarang selektif komite itu juga dapat dirasakan manfaatnya besar. Nah, di parlemen sendiri perannya juga sangat strategis. Saya ingin menyampaikan bahwa parlemen bukan hanya stempel saja sekarang. Proposal-proposal yang diajukan oleh pemerintah, baik berkaitan budget dan rencana undang-undang, itu dilakukan dengan begitu ketat. Ada diskusi-diskusi panjang yang melibatkan berbagai komite. Komite-komite tersebut bisa kita hire dari luar, bisa kita ambil dari dalam, dan bisa kita libatkan juga dari university, dari para pakar, dan bahkan tidak jarang juga kita mengadakan kunjungan ke luar negeri seperti ini. Beberapa hal yang sangat krusial pernah kami lakukan adalah pada saat pembuatan undang-undang yang berkaitan dengan protokol krisis. Ini undang-undang yang selama 22 tahun tidak pernah bisa dibuat. Alhamdulillah pada era saya ini kami di Komisi 11 berhasil itu dengan pemikiran-pemikiran yang memang bernas yang untuk kepentingan rakyat Indonesia pada masa depan. Kita tahu pernah kejadian 1998 pada saat krisis, Indonesia membailout banyak aktivitas ekonomi, di mana bank-bank bankrupt pada saat itu, ratusan triliun yang sampai sekarang juga masih dirasakan kesulitan pembayaran bunga terhadap kejadian tersebut. Nah, ini bagi kita tidak boleh terjadi lagi. Walaupun pada saat itu government sendiri tetap mengajukan, karena inisiatif ini datangnya dari pemerintah, mengajukan adanya bailout. Atas dasar kunjungan yang kami lakukan baik ke Tokyo, ke Turki, ke Belanda, Di situ jelas terlihat bahwa sejak awal tahun yang lalu tidak ada lagi bailout di Eropa. Dan hal itu kami bawa untuk rapat dengan pemerintah. Dan pemerintah juga dengan adanya komite-komite seperti ini, itu diskusinya begitu hidup. Mereka juga tidak merasa ada pressure yang tinggi, ada tekanan-tekanan yang membuat mereka melakukan sesuatu, tapi mereka melihat bahwa banyak masukan-masukan input kepada mereka ini untuk pembangunan semua ke depan. Dan alhamdulillah undang-undang itu bisa kita setujui dan itu berjalan dengan baik. Begitu juga baru saja mungkin kita ketahui kami juga sudah menuntaskan undang-undang yang sangat sensitif dan sangat strategis bagi Indonesia, yaitu undang-undang tentang pengampunan pajak. Nah ini juga kami melakukan banyak diskusi, banyak dengan komite-komite, baik komite pemerintah dan seterusnya. Ini kita lakukan dan sehingga dapatlah hasilnya yang menurut kita sampai saat ini adalah yang terbaik untuk bangsa Indonesia tentunya. Nah kemudian dari sisi pemerintah sendiri banyak hal juga dilakukan yang berkaitan dengan komite-komite ini. Karena apa? Beberapa hal yang dilakukan yang sangat strategis itu selalu ada semacam select komite yang dibentuk khusus untuk beberapa waktu yang lalu yang berkaitan dengan corruption. Memilih orang-orang yang in charge di bidang corruption itu, di lembaga corruption itu melalui satu komite yang betul-betul hadir dari berbagai pakar, orang-orang yang berpengalaman. Nah, banyak sekali hal-hal lain juga ini terjadi. Tadi menarik yang disinggung oleh Chairman bahwa ini bagaimana kaitan dengan anggaran ini. Nah, kita kebetulan bidang keuangan dan anggaran dari komisi saya, di komisi 11, kita sangat mendukung hal tersebut. Sehingga hari ini kita melihat banyak perbaikan-perbaikan yang kita rasakan atas hal yang kita lakukan berkaitan dengan komite ini. Nah, di internal parlemen sendiri kita juga banyak komite yang kita bentuk. Setiap komite-komite itu yang ada itu betul-betul merupakan pendalaman terhadap satu atau fokus terhadap satu masalah yang kita bahas. Baik itu masalah environment, masalah ekonomi, masalah sosial, masalah politik dan seterusnya. Ini pendalaman terhadap hal tersebut juga di banyak tempat itu kita lakukan dengan melibatkan banyak sekali pihak-pihak yang memang kita rasakan bisa efektif melaksanakannya. Kemudian dalam proses yang berkaitan dengan balancing terhadap power yang dipegang oleh pemerintah sama power yang dipegang oleh parlemen, tentunya kita bisa menghold anggaran pemerintah yang diajukan itu. Apabila kita tidak setuju, karena yang menentukan budget, proposal budget yang di awal itu berkaitan dengan growth, inflation, kemudian interest dan seterusnya itu ada di lifting minyak, itu ada di parlemen. Parlemen akan menetapkan itu semua, baru pemerintah bisa melaksanakan rencana pembangunan. Yang sebelumnya proposalnya tentu mereka bikin summary dulu, kemudian kita diskusi, mencari titik temu. Nah, yang menarik di sini adalah bagaimana kita di parlemen itu juga menjaga optimistik pemerintah, rasa optimis pemerintah untuk memajukan perekonomian dengan realistis yang ada di kondisi yang ada. Nah, titik equilibrium inilah yang kita selalu berusaha. Jadi pemerintah tidak bisa juga, let's say 2015 waktu revisi budget mereka mengajukan growth 6%. Karena harus mengejar visi presiden sebelumnya, visi presiden yang disampaikan pada saat kampanye akan tumbuh 7% average 5 tahun. Karena kondisi eksternal tidak memungkinkan, kita push down itu. Kita coba push ke bawah sehingga realistis, karena kalau tidak ada dua hal yang akan dilakukan. Nah, di sini ada keseimbangan. Kami sampaikan dari awal ke pemerintah bahwa kalau ini masih dipacu pertumbuhan setinggi tersebut, dua hal yang akan kita lakukan. Satu, nanti utang akan bertambah, di mana kita di Indonesia itu sudah memplot budget defisit itu adalah 3%. Kalau melampaui itu tentu presiden melanggar undang-undang. Nah, kemudian kondisi tersebut kita juga tidak mau pemerintah menurunkan seperti yang dilakukan atau disampaikan oleh banyak pengamat dan ahli bahwa itu pertumbuhan maksimal katakanlah 5%. Namun kita cari titik tengah, optimismenya tetap kita dukung, tapi kita menggiring supaya lebih realistis. Di sini kelihatan sekali pemerintah juga dengan legowo menyampaikan siap untuk melaksanakan juga, dan kami di parlemen juga mengawasi lagi, membentuk komite lagi. Jadi itu berkaitan awalnya adalah dari revenue side, dari penerimaan. Nah, dari penerimaan ini kita membentuk lagi namanya special committee. Nah, di mana kerja special committee ini memonitor, mendorong dan mencari tahu sampai sejauh mana kapasitas penerimaan negara ini bisa tercapai sesuai yang direncanakan. Nah, dalam special committee itu juga kita juga melibatkan banyak pihak. Kita turun ke lapangan, kita datang ke provinsi-provinsi maupun kabupaten kota, kita ajak semua potensial yang bisa membayar teks yang sesuai ditargetkan oleh pemerintah tersebut. Jadi kita tidak hanya mendengar one side atau satu sisi dari pemerintah ke kita bahwa laporan nanti akan tercapai, tapi kita juga langsung ke real sektor menanyakan bahwa mungkin tidak tercapai. Nah, beberapa hal memang di lapangan karena kondisi ekonomi yang sulit, produksi mereka menurun, penjualan mereka menurun, sehingga ini akan mempengaruhi terhadap penerimaan. Inilah kontrol-kontrol yang kita lakukan, dan dengan cara begini, alhamdulillah pertumbuhan Indonesia masih kita anggap walaupun turun tapi tidak terlalu banyak, masih bisa hampir mencapai 5%. Nah, mudah-mudahan dengan kondisi eksternal yang lebih baik dan sistem select committee yang dilakukan ini berjalan terus dan mendapat dukungan semua pihak, tentunya saya yakin ke depan tentu lebih baik, dan kita juga berharap Malaysia juga dalam waktu dekat bisa melaksanakan hal-hal yang baik dari apa yang dilakukan Indonesia ini. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih banyak-banyak. Looks as if his problems are not dissimilar from all our problems. These are basic issues. But saya nak tanya sikit. Kalau jika select committee bagi cadangan, tapi parlimen tak terima, kerajaan tak terima, macam mana boleh jalan? I'm asking, if you have a situation, and it can happen in very strong governments, very strong majority governments, you have all the select committee, they make a recommendation that they are noted, under consideration, we'll keep this in view, they say, tapi they don't take action.
Ya, jadi begini Pak, dalam kondisi seperti ini, sekarang kita melaksanakan full demokrasi. Artinya pandangan atau pilihan masyarakat menjadi objek utama dari setiap kegiatan ini, baik government maupun parlemen. Jadi fakta sekarang, apapun yang kita putuskan, baik itu kita sama atau tidak sama, partinya sama pemerintah, itu tujuan pemerintah dan tujuan parlemen member juga. Kalau ada select committee menyatakan itu untuk kepentingan masyarakat, semuanya akan mengkerucut ke sana. Itu fakta di lapangan. Jadi kalau ada perbedaan pandangan, kalau titiknya itu adalah untuk kemaslahatan umat atau kepentingan konstituen, itu akan bersama-sama itu melakukan. Beberapa program yang mendapat prioritas, misalnya pembangunan 1 juta rumah untuk poor people, kemudian membantu para nelayan dan seterusnya, itu walaupun ada perbedaan pandangan, tapi tujuannya sama, akhirnya itu bisa diselesaikan dengan baik.
Oke, Pak Jo, lagi satu. Korupsi, rasuah, itu perkara yang teruk di sini dan Indonesia juga. So macam mana select committee boleh kawal? No, I'm asking. Corruption is a big issue here in Indonesia. So if you have select committees, how effective are they in being able to control it or bring it down?
Yeah. Memang dalam mengambil keputusan langsung, karena itu perbuatan yang dilakukan orang perorangan kan, jadi sulit kontrol. Tapi suara select committee ini menjadi suara yang akan membesar Pak, seperti bola salju. Jadi once mereka mengamati itu atau mengontrol itu pengaruhnya mungkin pada saat itu tidak, tapi ke depan semakin baik. itu juga dirasakan di Indonesia pada saat ini. Di Indonesia itu terkesan bahwa sekarang kok ada tim yang khusus menangani korupsi, kok korupsi semakin besar. Bukan dulu lebih baik, tapi sekarang ditemukan hal-hal atau kesalahan-kesalahan masa lalu gitu. Nah, dengan adanya select committee ini, proses itu akan berjalan terus dan dapat dirasakan sekarang di setiap lembaga itu setiap bekerja jauh lebih berhati-hati daripada sebelumnya.
Tak boleh selesai langsung tapi boleh ambil lah tindakan ya. Tapi saya ingat negeri China lebih baik. Kalau dia tangkap orang makan rasuah, dia tembak, dia mati. In China, if you're accused of corruption, some chaps, maybe selectively or otherwise, get shot. It's happening in the Philippines too in a different way. So all this pertains to good governance. Kalau nak tolak, ya boleh tunggu lagi. Ada. No, bila, yeah. Now we have the Honorable Anna Elizabeth Burke. Sounds a very grand English name. And she's been Speaker of the House of Representatives for a few years, a member of Parliamentary Committee including climate change, which is vital. As you know, we have Jeffrey Sachs, who with Tan Sri Jeffrey Shah's generosity established a center here, perhaps the second or the first center in the whole world on the sustainable development goals relating to climate change. So you might want to comment on that. But we are happy to recognize that you're a graduate from Monash. And you're in your own home here. And we are inspired that you have done so well as a Monash graduate. So welcome, and please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I just want to start off by reiterating what Norman said, that this is only one part of effective governance, and I'm sure if I understood everything John had said, I'm probably reiterating everything he did. One of the terrors of being a native English speaker is that we don't learn any other languages, and it's an indictment upon most Australians who live in a multicultural society that we are actually terrible at other people's languages. In my electorate that I've just retired from, 47% of my electorate was born overseas. Most people speak Mandarin in my electorate than they do English, and all I can generally say is ni hao ma and she she, and a pretty good line in Happy New Year. But one of the things is that select committees, one of the perversities of the English language is that in England they're called select committees, in Australia they're referred to as standing committees. And we have select committees, but we only select them when we need it. Whereas in the English system, they have select committees that are standing committees, but they have standing committees when they need to select them. So it's a wonderful thing of the language. But they are very robust parts of our democracy, but they only operate in conjunction with all the other parts of the democracy. So again, independent judiciary, independent public service, independent electoral commission, all of those things go hand in hand to ensure that anything we do within that parliamentary sense is not just scrutinised by the parliament or executive government, but by the populace at large. And the populace at large gets to find out about it via the free media. So none of this works in isolation. But in our situation, one of the defining factors in both all of our parliaments is this distinction between executive government and parliament. And we've lost that distinction in all our parliaments. You know, we bemoan this in Australia, the growing control of executive government, the growing power of executive government. And how do we hold that as a parliament, not just a people's? You know, we have elections every 3 years. We're forever having elections. We've just had another one. So, you know, we have them and they're very important, but it provides a majority that forms a government that then that government, even people within that government, bemoan the power of the executive. How is one of those ways of keeping that power in check? And it is through a robust system of standing committees, which are, in my parliament, the same in the UK, made up of government and opposition members. And most people go into Parliament, I sound like the beauty queen. It's the only time I'm going to sound like one. You get the sash. Why did you go into Parliament? I wanted to make the world a better place. Well, I did. And I still do, actually. But all of us do. It doesn't matter what party you come from or how. And one of the ways of doing that is actually working hard in this system of parliamentary committees to ensure you come up with good policy as well as good scrutiny of bills. So our committee structure in Australia predominantly falls into two areas. It has references to look at various issues of concern to the day. One of the ones I chaired was a fascinating one, terrific one, was on introduction of our ETS, the Admissions Trading Scheme, that was then abolished by the opposition when they became government. I'm still getting over this. But that is what democracy is about, that different people and different policies come in and out. So we introduced it. But before we introduced it, we went through a very robust system of, it was fairly quick because we wanted to do it in the legislation fairly quickly, but it was a committee. So this, in our sense, was a joint select committee. It had members of the government, members of the opposition, members of the Greens and members of the Independent. We went around Australia. One of the big parts of our committee system is getting out to the people. Parliament is people, is for the people, by the people. I mean, a country like Australia, you can't expect everyone to get to Canberra. It's too hard, it's too difficult. We have a very diverse country, a very remote country, so a big part of our remit is to take that committee out. So in this case, we predominantly did major capital cities. We went to all the capital cities, but we also went and did some big regional visits, particularly to areas that will have big impacts. Some of the mining communities, a big issue around that, some of the areas where steel is produced, and some of the areas where the environment is impacted around the Great Barrier Reef. So we went out there. We call, if it's an inquiry into an issue, we publicise it in the paper. We write to various groups that we know will be interested, and we ask for submissions. So we get public submissions, we get submissions from individuals, experts. We then look at those submissions, and then we ask various people who've made those submissions to come and present to the committee. All this is funded through the Parliament, and the staff, all the committees have a secretariat. They are employed by the Parliament, not the government. The Parliament has a budget. As Speaker, I had oversight of that budget. The presiding officers, myself, and the President of the Senate. So we were accountable to that budget. You couldn't blow it like any other budget. I introduced a really measure that most of my colleagues didn't like. I took away the biscuits from every committee meeting. I said it was an absurd waste of money that you were catering. So each sitting week, committees meet generally when we sit. Parliament in Australia sits on average for about 22 weeks of the year. So each week they'd have a committee meeting and they'd cater for it. I just went, that's ridiculous. No more catering. You want a biscuit, bring your own. Made me very unpopular. But, we were asking for budget restraint across the board from everybody else. So we had to do things ourselves. Because we wanted to get the committees out there and we wanted to have good staff, that was more important than cups of tea. So it became, I wasn't popular for a while, but we got over it. And it meant that they had better resourcing of the committees that worked better. Because we have a bicameral system of government in Australia, we don't refer to ourselves as a Westminster system. Often it's referred to as a Washminster system, part Washington, part Westminster, because our Senate is directly elected. So our Senate committees are incredibly powerful. So we have Senate committees, House committees, and joint committees. Joint committees are pretty robust, so they're made up of senators and members from the House. Our Senate committees carry a lot of weight. They are always predominantly chaired by opposition members because in the Senate, you very rarely get the majority of the vote. So we have a really good check and balance to begin with in our parliamentary system anyway, because yes, you'll get it through the lower house. Legislation will pass the lower house because the government of the day has got the majority. Then it'll go to the Senate. It's not a guarantee it will ever pass the Senate. It may pass with amendments. It may never pass. When I was Speaker, it was a hung parliament. So a lot of the government legislation didn't pass. I used my casting vote as Speaker more times than anybody else since Federation. And if there was a tied vote, I actually voted against the government of the day every time. Made me very popular with several people, but that's the conventions So the rules are the rules are the rules. The conventions were, if there wasn't a majority on the floor, I, as Speaker, couldn't use my casting vote to give the government of the day that vote. I never did. Every time I did that, I would explain why I hadn't done it. So for us, the committees then put in another check and balance. But really it is this outreach, it is the education of the people about what Parliament's actually about. It is a distinctive beast from the executive and the government, and it's yours. It's your Parliament. It's not mine. I had the privilege of being elected and paid seriously well for 18 years to go there, but it wasn't mine. So we really see this as a way of interacting and going out, to scrutinise legislation, but to also develop good legislation. A lot of the times reports are written and sadly they do sit on shelves and they are ignored. And that is a real bugbear. So every report that is done by a committee in Australia must be tabled, and it must be responded to by the Minister within 6 months. The Speaker tables at the end of each 6 months a list of the reports that haven't been responded to and sends a stern letter to the Minister and says, why haven't you responded? A lot of them ignore it. We have got a system now where majority of ministers will at least respond. Because what has happened is we've been out to the community. We've raised community expectation that something might happen and change. So again, the push doesn't just come from the Parliament, it comes from the public. Like, we made a submission, we came to see you, why haven't you done anything? In some of our inquiries, we will have thousands of submissions. There was an inquiry into forced adoption in Australia. So during the sort of the 40s, 50s and 60s, single mothers were often put into hospitals and their babies were taken away. Big inquiry went on. Thousands of submissions from both the mothers and from the children who were put out to adoption. Huge inquiry came down. It led to the government of the day making an apology to the mothers and the children who'd been forcibly separated, and that has also led to compensation for various individuals and a look into the practice. And in some senses, particularly within our Indigenous community, is still going on today. So it really did lead to, it was a momentous day in Parliament. I was Speaker at the time that the apology was made. We also had an incredible inquiry that went on for quite some time into Indigenous detention in jail. Again, like most countries, tragically, our Indigenous community is overrepresented in jail. Huge report went on. There was actually also an external report. We have royal commissions. Again, the Parliament will look into and adopt. This was a big report. Again, it led to an apology in the Parliament to the stolen generation and to various changes in law. Sadly, we have now just announced another royal commission. This isn't a government inquiry, it's not a Parliament inquiry, but tragically into now juvenile detention of Indigenous children. So a lot of this comes from what we do in Parliament, swells into the public, might go on to something further. But our preeminent committees, Joint Public Accounts and Audits, is over 103 years old. It's been going almost as long as the Parliament has. The majority of people who've served on that committee end up being the Treasurers and the Prime Ministers of the day, because it's a good learning ground of how Parliament works. It's a good experience in what actually happens in Parliament. It's also a really good way in Australia of getting your face on the television. So if you are ambitious, this is what you do. You get a committee and you go with it. But also it's a good way for people who've been ministers and who've retired but still want to contribute in a parliamentary sense to be involved using your expertise. My first committee, when I first got elected, was the Economics Committee. Sadly, I did my economics degree at Melbourne and my arts degree at Monash, but forgive me for that. But I'd been working in banking and for the banking union, so that was my area of expertise, and I utilised it. So we also use the area of expertise that members of Parliament has. One of the incredible things about being in government, we all get into government, you think we can do so much. God, it's frustrating. It's incredibly frustrating, especially in opposition. It's just phenomenally, like you go in day and out, we're going to change the world. No, I'm not. you can do so much, but one of the ways you can actually influence is being on a committee. And you're not only influencing the policy, you might be also influencing your own party. You know, we've heard this, we've done this, so you take that information into your own policy formation. So that was a good way of doing it. But it is just a mechanism of demonstrating to the populace, particularly in our sense, most people understand Parliament as question time. I think question time in Australia is vitally important. But it just looks like theatre. It just looks like people yelling and screaming. If you want to, you can YouTube me. There are several videos of me yelling and screaming at people. Okay. Great job. I got paid to yell at people. A lot of them I didn't like. It was great. But that's what people saw on TV and thought that's Parliament. It's not. Most of Parliament is consensual. And one of the things you as a parliamentarian enjoyed doing was being on these committees and demonstrating we really did do good work that was, in fact, for the betterment of the country.
Thank you very much. A big clap. I'm going to ask you, you provoked me into asking this question.
I'll go for it.
How do I frame it without causing sensitivity?
That's right. I've been asked worse. There's a show in Australia called Q&A. Look it up.
I wanted to say this, that it appears the select committees work most effectively, or they are listened to more carefully when you have the population backing them up. If you have a silent majority, like in many countries, and particularly developing countries where democracies are not well developed and sophisticated, the select committees can shout their voices hoarse, but the government of the day, if it doesn't choose to follow the advice, can just ignore it all the same and pass the laws without the necessary amendments. Would you agree to that?
Yes and no, because some of our committees have legislative powers. So the Joint Public Accounts and Audit, the government of the day cannot ignore because it has legislative rights. So it depends on the committee and what it's doing. Some inquiry committees. I did an inquiry that went over 2 parliaments. We made 24 recommendations. The government only ever adopted 2. It was incredibly frustrating. But eventually it's all happened because of the public pressure. So it really, there's not a sort of one size fits all, because we've got, in the House there's 30 committees, in the Senate there's about 30 committees, and then there's joint committees. So there's lots, they have lots of different ones. So some of it, yes, it is public pressure, and for us it's also pressure at the ballot box every 3 years. It's a pretty tight turnaround. So yes, they can ignore things. Sometimes they can't because it is legislated. But for us, particularly the economic committees and the committees that oversight expenditure, they cannot ignore. All our committees, unless there's a really good reason, are conducted in public. Majority of them are televised. We call for public hearing. So everything is also out in the open. You can't hide. In our system, we also have this incredible thing called Senate estimates, which is the Senate committees, the standing committees, twice, say 3 times a year, called the minister and the heads of the department before them to explain the budget and where they spent the money. They are all publicly broadcast, and it is intense. That happens generally in two sitting weeks. So Parliament, the lower house sits, the Senate doesn't. It just conducts these Senate estimate inquiries. The government of the day cannot ignore them because it's the minister and the head of the department sitting there explaining. And again, if you get online and have a look at some of these inactions, incredible. And if they can't get an answer, they will sit there and say, well, we'll wait till you can get the relevant public servant to answer that question. And they will. They'll literally sit all night until somebody can rustle up somebody to answer the question. And they're incredibly robust. They can become very political. I'm not going to lie to you, those becomes fairly intense. But the government of the day has to explain. But yes, a lot of reference committees where we've got a good idea sometimes they can just wait until the right moment happens, or they can be ignored. And that's, sadly, that's part of life.
This legislature, you have elections quite often, 2-3 years, right? Over time, you might have the executive develop to be very strong, and the legislators come and go. You see, here we used to have permanent secretaries like the Westminster model for the heads of the ministries. After some time, we call them secretary generals because the members of parliament were more permanent than the officials.
Yeah,
So what happens then, when the executive weakens?
Our executive doesn't weaken. You will meet heads of departments who know that they can outlast their minister, and that's they'll literally just ignore their minister because they know that they'll last longer than the minister does, the head of the department. But nowadays, and we're fairly good in our system of, if there's a change of government, heads of departments, the heads don't roll. They're respected as independent, highly educated, robust individuals who provide terrific advice. But the executive is supreme to the departments. The departments, well, it depends on certain departments and heads, but they're offering advice. The advice is being taken. The executive is looking at, but also Parliament. Legislation doesn't happen in Australia unless it gets passed by the Parliament. As I say, it goes through the House, it goes through the Senate, it comes back to the House, and it then has to go off for royal assent. So even if a department head wanted to achieve something, he can't manipulate that. He or she can't manipulate that. We can do things by regulation. It doesn't have to go through a legislative system, but that's round the edges. Most of ours, if you want a major change, it's a legislative change. Scrutiny will go on. The external lobby groups will get involved. So if you're going to do something within the health sphere, the AMA, the Australian Medical Association, it's all the doctors, they don't let anything go through in that space without their voice being heard as well. So civil society having a big influence as well.
Good, thank you. Between you both, would you like to ask any question before we throw it to the House?
Would I like to ask any questions?
Ask question, comment on hers, or she can comment on your point.
The only thing I would add, I think, to what Anna says, was that there was a very good television programme in the UK about 30 years ago, which is still very funny and still very accurate, called Yes Minister. And if you want to know, actually, when you've been a minister, you realise that this is not comedy, it's documentary in terms of how it works. But it really is very funny, and if you haven't seen it, then Yes Minister is better than Yes Prime Minister. Yes Minister is very, very good. I should say that when I was at Transport for 3.5 years, by the time I'd finished, all the other ministers had gone, and most of the officials had gone, and I was left there as the only surviving person. There is an issue, seriously, in the UK context about how quickly officials move jobs. They've been promoted or they get other experience and so on. And actually I was rather alarmed at the lack of depth of knowledge by some of the officials, because they'd only just arrived, and I was telling them what was happening, and that seemed to me to be not quite right.
Good. Yes, Minister is classic, actually, but a lot of it is true, I think. Huh?
It is absolutely true.
All right. Now, in the House, anybody make the question short, sweet, and even a comment, but try and make it short because we want to have as many comments as possible. First question or comment, anyway?
I'll preface this with, I've had the privilege, if that's the right word, to know quite a few politicians and ministers through my working career. And I think the majority of people who do go into Parliament go to make it better. But nevertheless, that said, and from the kind of point of view of the electorate and the people, you talk about self-regulation, which is what the committee system is. And yet, our faith and confidence in politicians and parties is falling away. There's cash for questions, there's expenses scandals, all of those things. And, so how effective really is this? And how do we make it more effective so that we get more faith in our parliamentary system. Otherwise, we're going to have more Brexits, we're going to have more Donald Trumps, we're going to have more UKIPs.
Well, that's a really important question and doesn't lend itself to either a short or a very easy answer, to be honest with you. I mean, the MP's expenses thing in the UK, I have to say I was partly responsible for that in the sense that I put down the first freedom of information question about MP's expenses, and all hell broke loose when some of the answers came back. So I wasn't very popular with my colleagues, probably even less popular than Anna in terms of what she was doing in the Australian Parliament. But the system has improved, and the abuses which were taking place in that regard, people using expenses to buy duck houses and clear moats out and everything else, that's all stopped. So in a sense, although there was a damage to the system, the long term it's been mended. What happened was that the top was lifted off and it was horrible, but it's now been sorted out. So I think freedom of information I'm a great believer in. I think that is actually what keeps people honest and actually make sure that abuses don't occur. So that's one answer. However, you're raising a much more difficult question, and again, Anna may, I'm sure, want to comment on this as well. But what do we do about Donald Trump's and the Brexiteers and all these sorts of people? And there is, it seems to me, a malaise in Western democracies about either the faith in politicians or perhaps engagement in a accurate way with what's happening. You know, people aren't reading newspapers. When I was a transport minister, I went to this meeting of young bus managers. They were all under 35, and that's what they were doing. They were having a meeting, and I said, "What papers do you read?" And out of the room of 50 people, only one of them read a national newspaper. So people aren't, it seems to me, studying matters as deeply, perhaps, as they were before. They're relying on kind of, in the same way as people don't sit down in restaurants necessarily, they pick up a McDonald's in the street and wander down the street with a hamburger in their hands. The same thing's happening with news. They're sort of skating through the internet and finding bits and pieces, and they're not necessarily looking at things in as much detail. And I think, therefore, quite a lot of issues, including Brexit, don't lend themselves to simplistic yes/no answers or simplistic analysis. They require a bit of deep analysis, and people aren't doing that as much these days. So I think that the combination of a disquiet with politicians, which partly comes from some of the abuses which have occurred, but also in a sense, the less willingness of the population in some countries, including the UK, to actually delve into issues and understand them, and perhaps we would have done a generation ago, becomes quite challenging. I also think this is a dangerous thing for politicians to say, but I'm no longer in elected office, so I'll say it. Some of the population, I think, is becoming, dare I say, a bit childish. They throw their toys out of the pram and they don't get what they want immediately. And sometimes you have to take decisions that have a long-term consequence. I mean, building high-speed rail is going to cause a whole lot of problems for people up the line in the short term. I happen to think it's the right thing to do in the longer term, but you have to have some pain. And people are much less tolerant of that short-term pain, I think, than they were before. So I don't know what the answer to this is. I mean, Donald Trump is an extremely worrying situation. Donald Trump has been proven to have lied continually about things and to change his mind on a day-to-day basis, and the evidence is all there. I mean, what he says one day and it's contradicted by what he said the day before. It's on film. I mean, but nevertheless, it doesn't stop people voting for him, it seems. So I don't know what the answer to that is, but it's extremely worrying development that we have that in our society, I think.
I think it's a fundamentally fascinating question, and I suppose we need to make the distinction between parliamentarians and parliament. So our institutions need to be robust and survive even the worst excesses of ourselves. We all do these studies and we're going to do this and that and the other, and we forget the one underlying factor of all, human nature. And we're not perfect, and we all have flaws, and politicians are human beings. So one of the things for me, particularly about the committee system, is it actually can rise above a whole lot of that, disquiet and understandable distrust with the politician, because it's the parliament. It is the institution. So in Australia, voting is compulsory. You must vote. It's the only country in the world where it happens. I'm a great believer in it because most Australians are so apathetic they wouldn't bother turning up. And in the US, you may get Donald Trump elected by less than 20% of the populace. So we need to, in our context, engage with people because they've got to vote. So they've got to understand why they're voting, how they're voting, what it is. And we need to rebuild that trust. And if we can't build it in the parliamentarians, then in the institution. Otherwise, you don't actually have democracy, you don't have change, you don't see things move and alter. So for me, the committee system's always been this great representation of, well, you see all these foibles and us yelling and carrying on, but generally in a committee system, it's parliamentarians working together in a consensus fashion. We go out there, we listen, we take advice, we write a report. It's actually one of the ways of saying to the people, actually, Parliament can work really effectively. And so distrust us, fine, but have absolute faith in the institution because, it has these fundamentals and we need them there. And if we don't have all these foibles, if we don't have democracy, what do we have? I mean, it's the worst best system we've got. But what else do we do is the problem. And I think nowadays the news cycle is 24/7. It is relenting. But, if any of you watch Sky News, it's the same story, just repeated and repeated and repeated. So you can't avoid it. But, so it is also putting pressure on politicians predominantly to at least behave in a more appropriate manner. But I think we're living in a world with such uncertainty. I think that's part of what Brexit and Trump is all about. And in our context, a group called One Nation's just been re-elected into the Senate. There's sort of the lovely Pauline Hanson. People in Asia still remember the name. She's a shocker. But she and on her ticket, 4 people have been elected to the Senate. And there's this sense of, I want to feel secure again. I want to just feel safe because it's an incredibly unsafe world. And I don't know how to do that. And we don't know how to make it safe, let's be honest. So I think people are looking for some simple answers at the moment as well.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, did anybody want to raise a hand? Question? You come back.
Good afternoon. My name is Kumar. I'm a reporter. I would like to know when there is a scandal and suppose the Public Accounts Committee makes its report findings and then at a later part there are more revelations to the investigations, would the PAC in the UK or Australia reinvestigate the matter?
In our context at the moment, we haven't had too many scandals that have gone through something that's gone to the public accounts.
Lucky, yeah?
Well, but we've had more of the individual scandals. So the speaker who was appointed after me took a helicopter ride. It was a 20-minute helicopter ride. It cost $5,000. She lasted for 3 weeks in the media, and then they sacked her. Well, she actually resigned, but it was by virtue of public pressure. About 2 weeks later, the Prime Minister, who at the time was Tony Abbott, faced a leadership challenge internally, and he was no longer Prime Minister. So one helicopter ride, which was inappropriate to take and outside the rules, and the Privileges Committee was going to look into the Speaker, which is just unheard of. She said she was allowed to do it. The rest of the Parliament, and more importantly, the public went, nah. So she had to resign as Speaker, and one of the issues that sort of brought down the Prime Minister was that he had stood by her. So we've had some issues around contracts for defence that went through both the Joint Public Accounts and Audit and also the Joint Defence Committee. There were some queries. Nobody could get to the right answer. It was shelved. Somebody got the right answer. Everyone was brought back, and various peoples were definitely called to account. We had a situation where a billiard table was sold from the Parliament, and it was a deal done under the table between a couple of public servants, and one of our senators just went, this is wrong. It's public money. It was also part of the historical, acquisition of our parliament, should never have been sold in the first place. He was just like a dog with a bone. That went on for 2 years until he found out who it was, and that person was eventually charged criminally. So anything like that in our spheres, at a state level, we have independent commissions against corruption. They conduct inquiries, so outside the parliament, in a sort of an executive oversight. They go on. At state level, we don't have one federally. There's been a big call that we should have one federally.
The PAC or any committee can reinvestigate anything at any point, and if something happens, they can recall a minister and say, 3 weeks ago you said this, but subsequently it's turned out not to be true. Why did you say that? So they can keep calling the same people back again and again and again, and they can produce further reports and do whatever they want. I mean, there's no restriction on that. You don't get out of jail and then stay out of jail if you've done something wrong. Interesting. Anna talks about the speaker, because one of the experiences I had, which affected me, was when I started pushing for MPs' expenses to be public, with very few people supporting me, I might say, in Parliament. The speaker personally attacked me and a Labour MP called Kate Hoey for daring to do this. And the Speaker, of course, must never attack MPs. The Speaker has to defend MPs, not attack. He had to resign as a consequence of that attack on me and Kate Hoey at the time. The system does sort of regulate itself when people go beyond the bounds of what they should do. What I wanted to say, and I meant to say, because it's a terribly important point, I think it is anyway, in relation to the last question, was we've now got two things. First of all, the top Google inquiry the day after Brexit was people Googling, what is the EU? They didn't know what the EU was, and they were voting on it. And it brings into question whether you should have such decisions taken by the pop. It's hugely controversial and complicated decisions taken on a yes-no basis by people who are voting for different reasons. They don't like the Prime Minister or some other completely irrelevant reason to the question. But what worries me about Donald Trump and about Brexit and perhaps about Pauline Hanson is we're now seeing some people around the world picking on individual races or collections of people in the way they did in the 1930s and saying, let's build a wall in Mexico and keep the Mexicans out. We've got too many immigrants coming in Dover. We've got to deal with these people, these children we locked up. This is dangerous stuff. And I don't know what the answer to it is, but those of us who believe in democracy need to find a way of challenging all that.
All right, next question, please. Yeah.
This question is directed to Anne. Hello, okay, it's on. What are the possible avenues for public pressure? I mean, you mentioned public pressure a few times and it changed things. And very often we talk about the silent majority here. Perhaps it's not because they want to be silent, it's just because we don't know what to do.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, that sort of somehow we think it's the people, we refer to as on the hill because Parliament's on the hill. It's, those people on the hill, they're running the place. Well, no, we're there because we got elected. So for us, is what we refer to usually as the Herald Sun test. So that's one of our daily papers. So can this survive the Herald Sun? Bronwyn's helicopter didn't survive the Herald Sun. It failed the Herald Sun test. She had to go. So some of it is from the free media. That, as Norman rightly says, is having less and less influence. But it is out in the Twitter sphere. It is out on, social media. Lots of campaigns nowadays are being generated by social media. In Australia, we have a group called Get Up. They are a lobby group. They're not a politically aligned group, but they coalesce around issues. There's online petitions nowadays that will write and influence. And because that is so easy to do, so easy to coalesce various groups via the internet, we will be influenced by them. So those things happen. There is obviously groups that form, as I say, within the the Australian context. There's various business groups who are very vocal and have a great deal of say. There are, the trade union movement probably isn't as strong as it used to be, but it is still there. It is those various lobby groups that come together. Then there's the sort of the notion of the soccer mums, which I think is a demeaning thing to mothers who, choose to look after their children. But, this notion of a whole lot of mums also, again, via lots of web chat sites, become incredibly influential, and that you can run campaigns and issues via these sites that a whole lot of demographic are going to be on, and that becomes a way of influencing. So there was an issue in Australia about GST and inappropriately being placed on women's hygiene products, and it ran through this group of particularly mums who were sitting on various forums at night, put pressure on the government. They said they would remove it. They then couldn't get it removed. It was a bit of a backlash. So they still haven't removed it, by the way. But it's just those various pressure points that you can find, and that they have influence. People came to see me as a Member of Parliament all the time, and that's the other thing, you should have the right to do, is actually meet with your Member of Parliament. That's what they've been elected to do, to represent you. And I would say to the groups, but so-and-so won't meet with us. Well, fine. But, write to your local paper and tell them that your local member wouldn't meet with you. And if you can't get that, write it in the school newsletter. That goes to, 500-600 families. Out them. Why wouldn't they meet with you? So there are ways and means of doing it. And it doesn't have to be always confrontational. Some of it can be fairly polite. We have a lot of advocates in Australia about the government's cut the foreign aid budget. There's a whole lot of people lobbying about that, very successfully, predominantly through the religious sector, through the churches. A lot of ecumenical groups will come and visit. But we went and saw so-and-so and they said they'd do this. Well, guys, you've got all your networks. Use them. I mean, I don't want anyone preaching from, the pulpit, but you've got your newsletters, you've got your groups. We went to see so-and-so about why you've reduced foreign aid. Why haven't you done something about it? So there are lots of ways that you can do. That doesn't mean you're all on the street, or that, you have to sit back and say, well, there'll never be any change. You are the change. You're the ballot box. You're the voters.
I think the reality in this country and many others is that if it's not encouraged, you don't develop a tradition. Number two, if you have a Damocles sword over your head with a very draconian laws, then it is even more difficult. And the silent majority is strong in this country. They don't exert enough influence.
Look, I'd say the silent majority is strong in most countries. The interesting thing about the Brexit vote from a position abroad was all the people the next day went, and they were the ones who didn't go vote. The young people, it was.
Ignorant society.
And whether that's right or wrong, but that was the impression we got in Australia. There was the next day, there was this dawning of, what have we just done? Well, what you did is you didn't vote. But that was our impression, whether it's right or wrong. So it's, in Australia, there'll be a whole group, as I cited, the Indigenous community feel that they are completely overlooked. And they are, and you only need to look at the stats for me to be able to tell you that we do appalling things to our Indigenous community. Their life expectancy is worse, their educational outcomes, their incarceration is, terrible. So they as a group have felt for a long time, where is our voice? And how do we get heard? And, they've had to do various things. And it's hard. And sometimes it is scary.
Yep. Any other question? Yeah, the lady behind.
I was just wondering if you could both go into more detail about the safeguards to prevent government interference in terms of the funding of select committees and the timeframes and resources that select committees are given, because Parliament might vote on them, but what's to stop government whips interfering in that process? Is it all done by secret ballot? Because especially if you have very strong party presidents or leaderships that MPs are very beholden to, they might just do whatever they're told in terms of organising select committees?
Well, I mean, I'm going to make a confession here. I don't actually know what the budget was for the overall select committees. I mean, Anna was saying there's a budget head. No doubt there is one in the House of Commons. But I've never known a case where a select committee wanted to do something and someone stopped them doing it, or anyone's turned around and said there's not the money to do it. The regulation has been, as I mentioned, the self-regulation for the fear that if you do the wrong thing, you waste money and you go on a free trip somewhere to inspect eating establishments in Barbados, then you will be exposed, as a helicopter speaker was exposed in the Australian press. That is the safeguard and the control which exists. So I don't know of an example ever where a select committee has been subject to financial pressure in that way. And I think if the government of the day tried to do that, it would look clumsy and it would backfire. And I think all MPs would then turn around because they want to defend the select committee system and say you're not doing that. And that would be an own goal from the government of the day if they sought to do that.
I mean, it's really funny. So sometimes, the parties try and politicise some of the committees. And what usually happens is that the members of the committee get really fed up with it. Like it's, one or two individuals who try and play with it. I was like, no, that's not what we're here for. We're actually here as parliamentarians, not politicians. You've got to have that delineation. So in our system in the House, every committee is chaired by a government member. So there's generally 8 to 10 members. There's more government members than opposition. It's proportional, very much like in the Commons. But in the Senate, they can't control it because they don't have the numbers. So the majority of Senate committees are chaired by opposition members. That might be Labor, it might be Green, it might be Independent. And generally there, it's very much around what you're interested in, what your community's interested in. And again, it is a lot of self-regulation. The budget for the committees, there is a budget that comes, the Parliament has a budget to run. Part of that is running the committees. And yes, there were some limitations on it, and occasionally a committee would say, look, we need this expert, we're going to pay them, and you'd have to say, nah, you just can't afford it, that's not being realistic. And there's other ways around it. Most experts are happy to provide the information for free because their expertise is then also on the public record. Some of the expert witness got sick of it because, at one stage in the hung Parliament, we were having 500 inquiries on everything. It was a way of the opposition wearing everyone down. So some of the expert witnesses saying, look, just read that report. I've already read it. And that was becoming sort of ridiculous too. So you do need to look at them and say how much work can they do, how much work is realistic. But on the whole, we would find the ways and the means of ensuring the committees function well. As this, I use the flippant thing about the biscuits, but for me, was looking at ways to ensure I had the money to staff the committees well. And they are run by the Parliament. The government doesn't have the influence over the presiding officers. And even though in our situations the presiding officers aren't independent, they're from the parties, you're there to run the Parliament, so you respect that. And a lot of it has a great deal of respect.
Yeah, I'd just like to follow up on that. How effective can select committees be when there is a thriving environment of money politics? Money politics, buying votes, buying select committee members.
Well, I mean, if someone buys a select committee member or buys an MP or gets them to do something for money, then that's a criminal offence in the UK and to be prosecuted. And
if you're found out, though.
Yes, indeed. Well, I mean, this comes back to the first point I made right at the beginning, which is select committees. You cannot load everything onto one horse. You have to share the burden across a number of different things, whether it's freedom of information or a free press, etc., etc. So these things have to work together. So if select committee is the only thing which is working, then it won't work. It has to work as part of this matrix of democratic safeguards which has to exist in any society. But I mean, you have to have registered members' interest. We haven't raised that, but you have to be able to require MPs and indeed members of the House of Lords or I guess the Senate to put down what they own and what their interests are, so that if they start behaving in a way, you can say, well, you're doing that because you own that particular company. You require them to put that down. If they don't put it down, they can be hauled before the House of Commons they can actually, in extremis, be expelled from the House of Commons for misbehaviour. And there are mechanisms in the House which pull up members who've broken the rules, and then they suffer as a consequence of that. And in fact, one of the reasons why the previous Prime Minister, David Cameron, didn't like me very much was because in 2007, I successfully identified that he was using his parliamentary office, paid for by the taxpayer, to raise money for the Conservative Party. So I made an official complaint about that. He was found guilty of that as leader of the opposition and had to apologise to the House of Commons as a consequence of that. And I had to stop. So the system has to be robust, it has to be transparent, it has to be comprehensive, and there have to be sanctions there. And if those criteria apply, then the system to some extent regulates itself.
We must declare if there's a conflict of interest between an issue that has been investigated by the committee. So if you have any relationships to those businesses, you have any relationships. We had a situation where a minister's brother worked for one of the very large defence corporations that were being given a contract. At each question time, he would begin by saying, I must declare my conflict of interest. I'm the junior minister for defence. My brother is was the CFO of the organisation. So for us, it's a matter of being very upfront. But we have a very robust register of public interest. So we have a privileges and members' interests committee in both the Senate and the Reps. And each year you must declare what you own and where. Our current Prime Minister is a very, very wealthy individual. He's done incredibly well in business. He must indicate every share he has, every business connection he has, and all the rest of it. We are also full-time employees of the Parliament. We're members of Parliament full-time. I cannot conduct another business enterprise. And if I do, I would have to declare that. So a whole lot of members of Parliament who are lawyers, even if they're doing pro bono work, must declare that they're doing that work. And the thing is, if they don't, someone will find it out and it'll end up in the media. So I can't say that corruption doesn't go on in our system. I'd be completely naive to say that. I can't say that somebody hasn't been offered money, but we've got all the checks and balances in place to ensure it can't happen. And you couldn't be the head of a department and in government. You couldn't be on a corporation that has any government financing and in Parliament. It's just not on. It's just there. You've got to have some separation and delineation. So for us, everything is incredibly robust. If you want to go and see what I own, you can go and look that up. Literally, you can go onto the APH website. It'll tell you the mortgage I have. It'll tell you the mortgage my husband has, what superannuation fund I belong to, what superannuation fund my husband belongs to. It's pretty boring in my case because I don't own a lot. But there's some others that were fascinating. One of the members of Parliament who didn't re-elect the last election was a guy called Clive Palmer. Clive Palmer's business enterprises went on for pages. It was fascinating reading.
Oh, is that young woman? Yeah.
Yes, that's right. I'm interested to know. I noticed that I look at the website that let's say in the Australian Parliament there are 15 House standing committees, and also there are 12 joint committees administered by the House. So in all these committees, are there strong presence of the ministry officers, the government officers? And do they influence, the decision making of the committee members that compose of MPs? And number two is that what if there are disagreements among the MPs of different parties and different beliefs? How do you go about it? Do you present a report based on consensus, or the percent ratio of how many agree, how many no? And number three is that the law amendments and also drafting process, do you go, in your country, does it go through, all this law drafting or amendments, drafted, are they drafted by the drafting committee of the Parliament, of the House, or the ministry, or in my country is the Attorney General Chambers? Are the laws come from them, or, how to go about it? Reason I asked this was, in Malaysian parliaments, there was, in 2004, or 2005 to 2007, there was a select committee being established on amendment to penal codes and criminal procedure codes. So the Attorney General Chambers officers came in and so-called be our advisors, and they always exert their influence on the decision making, because we receive a lot of NGOs and publics come to give their views. And the sad thing is that after we presented the law and passed by the lower house and the upper house, what happened is 10 years later, many of the decisions be reverted back. And I felt, I mean, as a member of the select committee, I felt so angry and so sad. We spent 2 years to decide certain amendments, and we had taken into human rights and the government's position or police position into consideration, and everything went back to square one. So I want to know whether this kind of things that happen in your country. And
I think we got enough questions now.
Huh? No, that's it. No, I have 2 more. Defense, for example.
You see, actually, members of parliament are very special people.
Like, for example, like defense, an issue related to defense, buying of weapons and so on. Sometimes whenever we raise questions like this in the parliament, I mean, in my country, we don't have this kind of committee that is so specific. The minister always answer by saying that, this is confidential. The official confidential, because it's a defense, of the country, so they cannot review the budget. They don't give us more details, so we never know, actually what happened. What will happen in your country on the issue of defense, buying of weapons, and so on. And also, lastly, is that you have 12 joint committee and 15 standing committees in the Australian Parliament. How do you have your normal sitting? There must be a lot of concurrent, the committee sitting and also the main chamber sitting. How do you balance that? I mean, let's say if there are important issues that, need to be open for debate in the parliament, the main chamber, I mean, do you all still have your side meeting in the committees?
Yeah, I think this is going to be a parliamentary discussion.
Yeah, so going to the first one, ministers are not allowed to sit on committees. So ministers, if you're an actual minister, you aren't allowed to be onto a committee because you're responsible to those committees. But government members will go onto these committees. One of the big issues we've had over the years is ensuring they actually attend committees. So we actually now report who turned up, because sometimes it gets really frustrating that, you're doing all this work and some people have said they're going to go on a committee and they never turn up. And one of our problems, and we've been trying to address, Riles, we think we've got too many committees. And instead of getting less committees, we keep creating more. And that's the House committees and the joint committees. There's more in the Senate. So, but generally, most people will attend because they're interested in it. They're committed to it. I tell all the new MPs, don't go on more than 1 or 2 committees because the workload just becomes too great, especially first time round. So, the most you can really do is 3 committees. Sometimes that's difficult because, say, from the Greens party, there's only a handful of them. They try and cover all the committees. So it actually becomes a workload issue on top of everything else. But people attend because sometimes it's a bit of a career move, so you want to be there to be seen. Things like joint public accounts and audit, everybody goes. Defence and trade, everybody goes, because you've killed each other to be nominated onto that committee. So if you don't turn up, the rest of your colleagues will knife you because they want your spot, because they want to be there. So a lot of it is just about the interest and the thing. Sometimes, some of the outlying committees, people go, I don't want to go to that again. Publications committee, the library committee, they can be a bit tedious. But they're important committees. So you need to have, sort of a bit of a presence. But we have got now an audited thing to say who attended to make sure you turn up. But they all participate. All committee reports are generally done by consensus, and we arrive at a consensus result because it is about the betterment of the parliament. But you can put in a dissenting report. It happens occasionally, and often it is on political lines, not party lines, the differential. Like on the environmental report we had, the government of the day, which is mine, we put in a report. The Libs put in a dissenting report because they were always going to disagree with it. And the Greens put in another dissenting report because there were, they're purists. That's why they'll never be
Mr. Baker
government.
may want to add to it.
So just on those two things, but they work. And because they've been there for so long, for the whole time the Parliament's been there, they work. And so people come and they participate. Insofar as the defence issue, for us, all budgets every budget is public and it is put down. And as I said, we have these things called Senate estimates where they are scrutinised. Occasionally, they will say, look, we can't disclose the bottom line of that number because of commercial in confidence, or we won't go into everything because of security issues. People will accept that in a public domain, but we have the Foreign Affairs Defence Trade Committee and other subcommittees of that, which will meet behind closed doors and in-camera sessions. So the Defence Department, the intelligence committees must come and report to these committees. So it won't be public, but it will be scrutinised, and they can't hide. So they have a standing authority to call those individuals to come before them. So you'll see some days, there's lots of military in the building, and there's an inquiry going on. It certainly won't be broadcast for very appropriate reasons, but it still will happen. And again, my colleagues on those committees won't divulge to the rest of the party what's going on, but they know they've been held to account.
Okay, Mr. Baker, you want to
Just
come
very
in?
quickly, because I'm
I was
conscious.
trying to search for a pause and I couldn't get through.
Sorry. No, of course. There were a lot of questions. On that last point, very quickly, I mean, don't accept, I would advise you not to accept people who say it's a matter of national security, because that's such an easy excuse not to answer a question. Most information about defence can be safely conveyed to the public without any implication for national security at all. The fact that we're spending X amount of millions on ships is not a secret. It should be told to Parliament, and you can find out how much we're spending on ships, far too much as a matter of fact, which don't have the relevant material on them. However, that's another issue. We have, as the Australian example, I think, demonstrates, we have an Intelligence and Security Committee of MPs, elected MPs. So for the really, really sensitive matters, they can have inquiries behind closed doors, and they can go into really quite sensitive matters. Now, those reports aren't published in the same way, but they are cross-party committees which can look at these matters. The last point I want to pick up on, which is actually one that's not been raised before, but it's actually a very good point and a very important point, is drafting legislation. And actually, anyone can draft legislation. We can get external groups, for example, pressure groups who want to have a particular bill introduced who can draft it. But actually, an individual member of Parliament can get help to do that. We have in the House of Commons clerks who are employed by the House of Commons, not by government, but by the House of Commons. They're independent people. And if I want to go and have a bill, I just go up to the clerks and say, I want to have a bill which does this. They will then draft it for me. And I'll go and talk to them, and I have a bill, and I put it forward. The last bill I did was personal responsibility bill. I got fed up with people spilling hot coffee themselves and suing somebody. So I say, this is your responsibility. So I introduced a bill to exempt people from being sued if someone had failed to deploy common sense. And that bill was drafted for me by the clerks of the House of Commons, and I introduced it duly on the floor of the House of Commons. Government had nothing to do with it, but that was my bill, and I got independent professional advice from the Commons officials to do that.
As an opposition backbencher, in one of my terms of opposition, which were more than my government terms, I went to the clerks about a bill for the Do Not Call register, which is to stop telemarketing people ringing your home. It was based on a UK bill and another bill. So I went to them, I had my outline, the clerks went, yeah. I took it to we have a parliamentary drafting office. All bills are done separately, not by the Attorney General's department, so that the Cabinet, the Minister might decide on a policy decision, the department may have influence, but the actual drafting of the bill is done by consummate public servants who are employed by the Parliament. So the clerks helped me draft this bill. I tabled it as an opposition backbencher. We debated it. It ran like wildfire. 2 months later, the government of the day introduced, lo and behold, almost word for word perfect, the same bill I had done. They claimed it, they introduced it as law. I claimed that as my bill from opposition. But all the drafting of that to ensure that it was legally compliant and constitutionally valid That's one of the reasons that some of these Senate committees are really important now, because we've often had legislation introduced in such a hurry, we've passed it and then they've gone, it's not constitutional. We've had that. It's gone off to the High Court and it's been declared invalid. So everything for ours goes through checks and balances, and it is not done by the Attorney General. Even government ministers would not cop that in our systems.
I think it's clearly a different background, a different environment, a different tradition. I cannot imagine that as a civil servant, I could have been persuaded to draft some questions or legislation for an opposition person. I would be charged.
It's not the public servants.
They're not civil servants.
Not civil servants.
They're
These are employees at the Parliament.
They're employees of the
It's
House
the
of
Parliament.
Commons.
Yeah.
Employees of Parliament are not civil servants.
No.
Oh, here they are.
No, they're
The clerk of
employed.
Parliament?
No, the
yes,
clerks.
Miss American, yeah.
Yeah, if I could, good afternoon. On this particular issue is something that we are also raising as part of the work on parliamentary committees. There is a law, the Parliamentary Services Act, which was, I think, repealed. Under that act, previously, Parliament does have its own staffing. And but that was repealed, and then all the staffing was done by the Public Services Authority, and then they are then governed by the PSD, which is very similar to the UK system, and they are transferable. So there is no chance for Parliament to actually, have staff who are experts in parliamentary work, and this is something that we need to reinstate.
Yes.
You don't really have to change the law, just reinstate back that old law.
To go back to the point that
And there must be a political will to do it.
but to go back to the point, the public servants of the day are responsible to the government of the day. So as an opposition person, I couldn't talk to a department unless we have shadow ministers. Shadow ministers might ask the minister if they can have a briefing from the department. But the public servants respond to the government of the day. But in our system, we have parliament staff, the clerks, advisors, the drafting officers, the library. We've got this huge library that provides, about 200 researchers. They can help anybody. And they are there to provide independent advice to a government member, opposition member, independent member. And we also have a thing called the PBO, which we modelled on the English system, Parliamentary Budget Office, so it's an independent system to provide free and fair advice to all parliamentarians.
I think we have come to the close of a very, very exciting session. It just remains for me to try and see if I can sum up very quickly. One, it has been exciting, that you all agree. Two, I think we all have a consensus, which I think we are reinforcing the meeting yesterday. We need more parliamentary committees. When I hear you got 5, 10, 20, 30, and we got just a handful, and even those are not very effective, or not effective at all, I'm afraid there has to be some basic rethinking.
You got 5, I think, I remember reading.
Yeah. But the only one you hear of is the Public
one-
Accounts Committee.
But 4 are kind of internal, I think.
Yes, and they're not functioning, some of them.
All right, and then I go on. These parliamentary committees can be only effective if the whole environment supports it. If the environment is not suitable or immature or handicapped, parliamentary committees cannot flourish. The point was made by the panelists that in the end you need popular support for parliamentary committees. The push must come from them because it won't come from the government. I think we recognize that we are not at the state of development of countries with 100, 200 years experience in democracy, and this has to evolve. But the tragedy is with modern communication, we cannot afford to wait too long. We can't wait for it to ripen because it'll fall off the tree. I think the point was also made that the institutions are vital. They need to be preserved, protected, and nurtured, and they are definitely much more important than individuals. But when you have a situation where some individuals are more important than institutions, then the system is at great risk. I think there's a growing worldwide tendency to distrust politicians, with due respect to the ones here. You're not in agreement too, huh? Yeah, Muhammad? There is a distrust for politicians. Unfortunate, because I think, especially in countries where there's high corruption, where there's not slow deliverance, when there's a lack of fulfillment of goals, then people think everybody is a Donald Trump. And I don't know what the answer is, except for literacy, political literacy, and the political will of leaders themselves to want to change their image. Finally, I think whatever we do, we must do it with sincerity, and there must be a robustness in the institutions and the individuals and the population at large. It's a collective effort from all sides. And if one side is missing, like the three pillars, the legislature, the executive, one of those pillars are missing, then, and the judiciary, then the whole system slowly weakens. So much so Tun Musa Hitam has said what some others have said before. We run the risk of a failing system if we don't back up and improve this, the weaknesses, overcome the weaknesses. And one big way forward is to come back to our subject to ensure there's effectiveness in the parliamentary select committees. On that note, let me ask you to please join hands and thank our distinguished speakers, to say we have enjoyed them. Let them please come back again, and by that time I hope we would have improved. Thank you all, the questioners and the audience. Thank you very much. Now I call upon Dato Chu to please do us the favor of making a little presentation to our exceedingly great speakers.